Hello, my name is Derek Atkins, and this video lecture is entitled Postmodernity and the Moral Life. This video lecture is for the course Christian Worldview and Biblical Decision Making at the East Asia School of Theology. Postmodernism. The very name postmodernism suggests a direct link to the pervasive worldview of modernism. Indeed, postmodernism could not exist except in a world after modernism. But what exactly is postmodernism? What does postmodernism teach? And what does postmodernism have to do with us as Christians and with ethics? These are some of the questions that we're going to look at in today's video lecture. Let's begin by trying to simplify the rather complex but important historical relationship between modernity and postmodernity. Modernity's promise for a better world and a universal culture of peace, prosperity, and eternal youth turned out not only to be empty, but brought with it unprecedented levels of human need and suffering. One huge landmark event was the First World War, which shattered the dreams of modernity's promise that science and technology would inexorably usher in a new era of human well-being and universal goodwill toward all mankind. Since that time, history has done nothing to stem this disillusionment with the modern understanding of inevitable moral and social progress. As Richard John Newhouse noted, this presumably enlightened 20th century has loosed more rivers of blood and piled up more mountains of corpses than any century in history. In addition, modernity's colonial thrust had two important results. The first is that colonialism brought Western culture into contact with many other ways of seeing and acting that appear to be just as effective, if not more so, in helping people live well in the world. And second, colonialism empowered colonized nations to become independent. Ironically, modernity was increasingly unable to withstand a rigorous modernist intellectual analysis of most of its major premises and claims. Paul Hebert puts it this way: modernity was built on skepticism toward traditional knowledge. Postmodernity is built on skepticism toward modernity. It is therefore not surprising that some scholars prefer to call postmodernity ultra-modernity instead, although I might argue that some of the other worldviews we have been discussing could also be seen as increasingly extreme intensification of modernity's main tenets. Of course, it is not surprising that modernity was unable to withstand such a critique, because as a worldview, it is false in several crucial and important ways. On this particular point, Christians certainly can and do agree with postmodernity, but some of the methods of critique that are used need some questioning and revision. And as we shall see in a moment, the conclusions and solutions to modernity's failures are perhaps in some ways even less convincing and satisfying than the claims they were meant to replace. In view of its tendency towards scientism and naturalism and its attendant lack of transcendence, modernity produced a severe crisis in finding a sufficient basis for both ethics and enduring personal meaning. The late modern shift from material progress to the exponential proliferation of information has created a severe crisis of stability, identity, and certainty. Thus, postmodernism is yet another attempt to give human beings a viable worldview from which to live in the contemporary context. Some recent adherents to the postmodern worldview include Richard Rorty, Jean-Francois Lyotard, Jacques Derrida, and Michel Foucault. So let's look at what some of the things are that postmodernity claims. The first claim of postmodernity is that all views of reality are perspectival. That is, truth is not objective, certain, or value-free. Descartes wanted certainty in knowledge. That is, in order for anyone to really know anything, he believed you had to somehow have certainty. Postmodernism rightly points out that it is impossible to be certain about anything at all if you have no access to God or to any other kind of standard outside of the system of the cosmos. In this, they are like nihilists and existentialists who see the inconsistencies of naturalism. But Christians also see this as well. The conclusions they draw from this critique, however, are far different from the ones that the postmodernists draw. Instead, postmodernists claim that if you cannot have knowledge without certainty, as Descartes assumed, and as Hume, the skeptic, believed and delighted in pointing out, then, in fact, you cannot have knowledge at all, at least not without some sort of foundation upon which to build and assume the reliability of our mental faculties. Knowing or recognizing this, postmodernists simply deny the possibility of transcendent knowledge. Things could be known in fact, but only known so far as they were relative to the person and society in which they originated. There was no transcendent reference point for knowledge, at least not that we could have any access to. And so knowledge and truth are not absolute, but integrated into the fiber of the individual and the society in which he or she is a part. The result? Meaning is relative to the languages used by the society, for it is by language that meanings are created and embedded into cultures. Thus, no culture has a truer perspective than any other, and there is no way to evaluate outside of one's own culture the issues and disagreements raised by colliding with other cultures. Another claim of postmodernity is that all truth is constructed and self-serving, including scientific claims to truth. In addition, postmodernity claims that all totalizing theories of truth are rationalist myths and nothing more than veiled attempt to dominate and control. Put in another way, and in a rather jarring way, truth is nothing more than a well-disguised form of terrorism. And this brings us to the next claim of postmodernism. That therefore, any and all authoritative truth claims and meta-narratives must immediately be subjected to an unrelenting attitude of suspicion. Rationality itself is subject to critique and a hermeneutic of suspicion. Nothing is sacred or protected from postmodernity's ruthless razor. Religion and science are especially placed beneath the totalitarian boot of suspicion and made the subject of widespread critical deconstruction to reveal them for what they really are: cleverly masked attempt to control and manipulate others. There simply is no privileged view from nowhere through which we can see and judge the world and all it contains. What we are left with is stories, but all stories are subjective and imperialist by nature. Even individuals are merely constructs and not objectively accessible beings. Therefore, the truths and stories we tell are merely useful fictions that we tell to gain power over others. In other words, the truths and stories that we tell are useful fictions, but are not true in any trans-temporal or transcultural sort of way. If we can persuade people of our story's usefulness, then we become powerful. This is a play on the idea that knowledge is power. Those who can persuade people that their story is true are the ones who become powerful and can tell everyone else what to think and do. But it is important to note here that this is all that knowledge is, according to postmodernists. It is not really true. It merely provides the ability to wield power over those who believe it. Adolf Hitler took this idea from Nietzsche to heart and created a story now known in infamy as the stab in the back story, which claimed that the German army was winning World War I, and the only reason why Germany lost World War I was because the German army was betrayed by democratic forces on the home front, and especially by the Jews. Another claim that postmodernism makes is that differences must be tolerated and even celebrated rather than evaluated and or assimilated, for all attempts to assimilate or criticize them are nothing more than mass power plays. For those who ascribe to them, these postmodernist claims almost invariably lead toward radical ethical and cognitive relativism. As a result, we must now tolerate and accept other points of view as equally valid constructions and expressions of reality. This very ironically sounds very moralistic and intolerant, doesn't it? This attitude inevitably leads to the radical fragmentation of all human life. This is more than a fragmentation of human labor. It now extends to all thought and activity within the scope of human existence. So this fragmentation involves all the different areas of life, including intellectual, artistic, experiential, relational, ethical, and religious. So now that we've looked at some of the claims of postmodernism, let's now look at the implications of postmodernism, especially for Christian ethics. The first implication is the challenge of intellectual and moral relativism. In relativism, the claim is that since no universal moral principle or principle can be agreed on by all peoples in all time and in all places, and since its opposite view leads to arrogance, intolerance, and violence, there are, or perhaps there should be, no absolute standards of right and wrong. Right and wrong are merely determined by the individual, that is personal or subjective relativism. It's determined by the situation. See the situational ethics of Joseph Fletcher, or it's determined by the collective culture of the day, that is cultural relativism, or some combination of all three. Therefore, ethics are intensely personal and deeply emotional, but ultimately just the conventional product of societies and individuals. See Genesis 25, 29 through 34. And this passage from Genesis is talking about when Esau gave up his birthright for a bowl of hot soup. So this view essentially ascribes to emotivist theories of ethics. And emotivism is making ethical decisions based on how we feel about certain things. A.J. Ayer, an ardent proponent of logical positivism, said that we make moral decisions on the basis of what we like or dislike or how we feel about it. Thus, in this theory, something is right or wrong to us on the basis of our personal preference or feeling about any given action. So, homosexuality is wrong because it's nasty to me, not because it's wrong in some sort of factual or actual way. Thus, ethics become a matter of personal and or social preference, something to be chosen like a flavor of the month. In the words of Stan Gade, we choose beliefs the way we choose an entree at a restaurant, taking whatever juicy morsel pleases our palates. This not only puts the self at the center of the choice-making activity, but also puts great pressure on those who are trying to persuade others. The pressure is to make one's belief conform to consumer demand. While this may be descriptively true in the eyes of the sociological ethicists, it still does not give any sort of criteria by which to judge competing preferences. If I like to kill people whom I disagree with, what can this theory say to me that will stop me or call me to some sort of moral accountability? Once again, emotivism simply does not provide any adequate basis for evaluating competing personal or cultural preferences. Therefore, we have no independent basis or justification by which we can judge or evaluate other people or cultures. Why? Because there is no evaluative meta-narrative, and they don't speak our language. Thus, we shouldn't and don't have the right to impose our language, our story, our metaphysical systems of truth and ethics upon theirs. Why? There is no way to tell if our story is any truer or better than theirs. Thus, without a standard to judge, we simply cannot judge. All we can do is tell stories to one another and hope some understanding will take place. And this is why I chose this slide to illustrate this point. This is the attitude that postmodernity leads to. You have no right to judge me. So that's one of the things that postmodernity leads to. Another implication of postmodernity is absolute freedom and the toleration of all points of view are the only good for which we must fight, which is really completely inconsistent with all that we have talked about so far. But old appendages from the days of yore are often slow to fall off, even long after they have died a slow and painful death. Believing this leads us into emotivist theories of ethics and ultimately to ethical relativism. Evaluating this perspective adequately, this whole postmodernist perspective adequately would take more time than we have to take here in this video lecture or in our class. But allow me to make just a couple of observations. First, no moral differences between cultures have been frequently overstated or exaggerated. In his book, The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis rightly points out that there is far more moral agreement between cultures than disagreement. But even if there were widely divergent moral perspectives between cultures, this does not necessitate the conclusion that moral relativism arrives at. There could be other equally plausible explanations. Christianity, with its doctrine of humanity's depravity, certainly offers one. In addition, there is no way to evaluate any other culture or individual in the case of competing moral values. But this creates significant problems when one culture is aggressive and oppressive in nature. What can be done with Nazi Germany in a cultural relativist world? Or how can LGBTQ supporters reconcile their support of Palestine with the reality that the Palestinian Authority does not support LGBTQ rights? No judgment can be passed, for there is no standard outside of the culture which can stand and judge it. Finally, how is it that the moral relativists seem to make tolerance an absolute virtue when no moral absolutes exist? Why is toleration of all culture more moral than elimination of all cultures which differ and will not agree with the aggressor's culture. What can be done with a culture whose moral values drive it to conquer and to kill all other cultures that do not agree with it because power and conformity are its greatest values? Or what about the culture that cares more about animal life than human life? In the words of ethicist and professor Scott Ray, the relativist still has a moral absolute that makes the system self-defeating, namely the absolute of tolerance and the respect for the values of other cultures. The relativist could hardly tolerate any culture that had intolerance as one of its central virtues. This intolerant rejection of those who would dare not tolerate something is quite evident in our world today, is it not? This is exactly what we see happening today. And this leads us to the fragmented life. By fragmenting life into numerous separate arenas, it makes the idea of living a single coherent lifestyle under a single set of understanding and judgments and action. In other words, under a single and overarching meta-narrative, increasingly difficult to do and is seen as not only an impossible goal, but as is also seen now as not even a desirable goal. Pragmatism makes it not only seemingly unnecessary to live this way, but even ridiculous and detrimental to a person's well-being to do so. In this way, people tend to pick and choose what pleases them and is convenient. Some call it a smorgasbord theology, but it goes beyond the merely religious and infects virtually every area of life to the extent that people don't even think it's strange or immoral to be almost a different person in different areas of one's life. Christianity, in stark contrast, calls us to live under a single comprehensive lordship and to have complete integrity and consistency in every aspect of our lives. But it finds itself called to do so with increasingly fewer and fewer reinforcing resources at its disposal. As Hollinger puts it so well, within the Christian ethics orbit, cultural and social fragmentation create an ethos in which appeal to the Christian worldview becomes difficult, even for Christians, for they too experience the fragmented world and think in fragmented forms. The appeal to a foundation of the triune God and the Christian worldview of creation, fall, redemption, and eschaton is difficult when people no longer view reality with a sense of coherence and wholeness. The attempt to develop consistency of thought and application within the Christian worldview and ethics is a major challenge. As a result of fragmentation, we lack the ability to discern which values and virtues are most significant for the moral life and which ideas and images can truly guide our ethical thinking. And finally, we have the challenge of psychotherapy and other attempts to find salvation. People increasingly look to other strategies than religion to find personal happiness and fulfillment, especially what are termed therapeutic approaches. This does not mean that therapy per se is wrong, but it is to say that people increasingly look to practical strategies to find meaning and joy in life that largely ignore or exclude any reference to or concern for the divine, for the transcendent, or for the religious. Within the church, people are increasingly turning to places and people other than the church. They look to such things as entertainment, things as in objects and stuff, technologies, therapies, and medication to find meaning and well-being. They know they should have a modicum of morality in their lives, but this is not seen as holiness so much as a general notion of what it means to be a generally good and moral person in contemporary society. This ideology and framework are what sociologist Christian Smith calls therapeutic moralistic deism. So we've looked at what postmodernism is, and we've examined some of the implications of postmodernism. So I want to encourage you to complete your reading for this particular lesson. And in class, we will talk about modernity and postmodernity. So I look forward to seeing you in class.